Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to show you how to perform project finance modeling. Let's begin by looking at part 2 of the course outline. Part 2 is about project finance modeling, where we have chapter 5 and chapter 6. Chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7. Chapter 5 looks at the financial assessment process. Then chapter 6 looks at the financial models for the SPV. Then chapter 7 looks at the financial models for the lenders. For the purposes of this class, we are not going to look at chapter 7, which is the financial models for the lenders. We'll only look at financial models for the SPV. So we would want to start by looking at the financial assessment process, then move on to the models for the lender, the models for the SPV. So let's do that straight away. So the financial assessment process, okay, you can follow that link if you would want to open an example of a project. You can follow that link. You can do that project on your own during your own spare time. Okay. What to expect in this chapter? We're going to look at the financial assessment process. Okay, then we'll look at a case study in independent power plant. We'll do this as a prac. Then we are going to build and analyze the best case model. We also carry out SPV's initial assessment, and we also look at the initial assessment by the lenders, though this is not as important as the assessment by the SPV, but we'll just briefly look at it. Okay, we intend to develop a financial assessment model for the SPV as well as other interested parties. So when we do the modeling process, we have two major players in mind: the SPV and the lenders, as well as other interested parties to the project finance deal. So the SPV is also called the special purpose vehicle or the special project vehicle, and is the one responsible for the implementation of the project on the ground. Depending on how the deal is structured, normally the government as the principal would assign the SPV to carry out the project, and the SPV would be responsible for entering into various contracts with other parties, including the lenders. The lenders are the providers of the finance that we need, the money that we need to undertake the project. Part of the money could be provided by the government, that is the principal, and part of the money could be provided by the lenders. But in this case, we assume that the money that we need for the project finance is being supplied by the lenders. So in this case, the model that we construct is very, very important for the lenders as well as other parties. Okay, before we do the actual modeling, let's look at the financial assessment structure. You can follow all these other links. And see what's there Let's have a look at the financial assessment structure. So this is the diagram for the financial assessment structure. On the right we have SPV assessment. So this is the initial stage where the SPV does the financial assessment. Then after the SPV financial assessment, we move on to the lender's assessment. So the lender does an assessment of the whole project finance deal. Then we have an SPV and lender final assessment. So the two will do a financial assessment and actually reach financial close at the end of the day. This process has been adopted from these authors. All right, let's look at the SPV financial assessment. The first stage in the financial assessment by the SPV is estimation of activities, times, costs, and revenues of the project. So one has to look at the activities, what actually needs to be done, when, that is the timing, and the costs and revenues, the costs associated with the project, and also the revenues, the amount of money or the money that would be generated by the project. That's the first stage. Normally under the first stage, under activities, as project finance specialists, sometimes we might not be well conversant with the terms that are used in a project finance deal. For example, in a hydroelectric power plant project finance deal, there is need for massive or for extensive consultations with people who are into electricity generation, with electrical engineers. So there is a lot of consultation in terms of activities, the times, and also the possible costs. Okay, then secondly, development of base case, right, of a base case model to determine the CCF. CCF stands for cumulative cash flow, and the economic parameters of the project. So once you have your base case model, you can go ahead now and determine the cumulative cash flows. Once you have the cash flows, you find or you calculate the economic parameters for the project, the IRR, NPV, cash lockup, the payback. So these economic parameters would tell us if the project is viable or not. Then you move on to identify risks. You are now incorporating risk into your project finance modeling. You are now incorporating risk by means of determining the best case scenario and also the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is a situation where we say, if things go well, what happens to our revenue and what happens to our costs. The same with the worst case scenario. If things go the other way around, if everything turns out to be the opposite of our plans, if things go the worst, what happens to our revenues and also what happens to our cost. Then what would happen also to the economic parameters, the IRR, NPV, CLAU, and the payback. Then assessment of the base case model incorporating risks. Then at the end of the day, the SPV has to make a decision regarding further assessment. If there is need for further assessment, a reassessment can be done. But if there is no need for in reassessment, then the model is handed over to the next stage, which is the lender's assessment. Then the lender does his assessment as well. Then the two would also go on and do a combined assessment of the deal until they reach financial closure. So for the purposes of our module today, let's quickly turn back and look at the SPV assessment. We want to do some modeling for the SPV. So having looked at the financial assessment structure diagram, let's quickly look at the SPV's initial assessment in detail. The SPV is initially concerned about the initial viability of the project. That's the major concern of the SPV, if the project is commercially viable. The SPV identifies the project's major activities, like I said, the costs, the revenues, and also the timing. The SPV makes estimates of the project's capital, right? That is the capex, the capital expenditure, and the operational expenditure, that is the opex, and revenue generation over the project's life cycle. Okay, so when we talk about capital expenditure, we are saying how much do we need in the form of capital to finance our operation and also to finance the project. Okay, then operational expenditure, how much do we need during the operation during the operational stage of the project. Then the revenue that would be generated by the project once operations start. So all these activities would be estimated. The amount of money would be estimated in each case for each activity, and also the timing. Okay, the SPV develops a cumulative cash flow model to determine the project's best case economic scenarios, which include those are the economic scenarios which the SPV would determine. In many cases, the project's IRR is the metric used to determine whether further assessment is required. This is often based on the minimum acceptable rate of return set by the SPV. So the internal rate of return is normally used, but it's used in conjunction with all other economic parameters. The IRR is compared. You compare it with the minimum acceptable rate of return. Okay. Risks associated with the project are identified to determine if there is need for reassessment. In most cases, these risks will not be assessed individually, with the SPV relying on a deterministic analysis to determine the worst and best case scenarios. So the risks won't be determined individually, but there is need for the SPV to use deterministic analysis. Okay, the SPV can use deterministic analysis or can go a step further and use stochastic analysis to determine the worst and best case scenarios. But for our module here, for our course, we are going to use deterministic analysis. Right? How this is performed? This is often performed by assuming a range of 5% gain in the best case and 10% loss for the worst case. Okay, so we are assuming that if all goes well in the best case scenario, we talk of a 5% in the best case scenario and 10% in the worst case scenario. The 10% worst case is sometimes referred to as the red line. So if we perform, or if someone would assume that our project won't perform below 10%, that is in the worst case scenario. Okay, if the project is deemed commercially viable, typically based on the worst case scenario, when the worst case scenario IRR, then further assessment by the lender to determine whether the project is bankable is performed. So when we are sure, when the SPV is sure that based on the worst case scenario, the project is commercially viable, then the model would be handed over to the lender, where the lender does also his assessment. If the worst case scenario does not meet the SPV's required return, the project can be reassessed and no further assessment can be recommended. Okay, right? You can follow that. You can follow this link as well. You can follow this link and see what's there. Okay. Assessment of best case model incorporating risks. Right? In addition to the best case model, we determine the economic parameters for the best and worst case scenarios. Right? Best case 5%. That is, you assume that the revenue would rise by 5% and the cost would drop by 5%. Okay? Then the worst case, you also assume that the revenue drops or would drop by 10% and our cost would rise by 10%. Okay, that's why I told you that we have a range. We have 5% and 10% respectively for the best case and worst case scenarios. Okay, So typical costs and revenues over the project's life cycle, the capital expenditure, the capitalized interest, the total revenue, operational expenditure, cost of materials supplied. So those are some of the revenues and costs associated with a project over its life cycle. You can also follow this link as well. Okay, so having looked at this, I'm sure we can move on to the next video and look at the modeling. Thank you very much.